Hi, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Rashada with the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program for Strategic Research and Studies, and today I am joined by Dr. Tezcur. Dr. Tezcur received his PhD from the University of Michigan. His primary areas of interest and research are in the Middle East, political violence and nonviolence, as well as Kurdish politics. Dr. Tezcur, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I understand that you just came back from Kurdistan, actually right after they signed the independence referendum, and I wanted to lead with that. Can you explain to us the importance of the referendum?
It has been a month, more than a month since the referendum took place, and so many things happened since then, especially in the last 2 weeks, since October 16th. So depending on what time frame you look at the referendum, the interpretation will be very different. Because initially, at least in the first 2 weeks of October, there was a more enthusiasm and then some kind of expectation. But especially after the fall of Kirkuk in basically less than 6 hours on the night of October 16, that became a very different story. So in this sense, retrospectively speaking, it doesn't look like a very good decision, the independence referendum. But then I can also say that when I was in Kurdistan in the last week of September during the referendum, it was a different story because there was too much uncertainty in the sense that people or the leadership was basically committed to it, but at the same time they were making lots of calculations and assumptions which were very hard to verify. And what happened is that, like, especially in the second half of the October, then all these assumptions turned out to be false. And then the decision turned out to be not a very good outcome for the Kurdish people in Iraq. But then again, I mean, now I had basically the advantage of talking on October 31st. So if you had this, like the podcast, maybe in the first or the second week of October, then probably we were talking something very different. I mean, now it is easy for us to basically make this judgment. But again, in politics, when you make the decisions, there's too much uncertainty. And again, you have to make lots of assumptions that you cannot verify. And then ultimately, it is the art of decision making under high levels of uncertainty. And in this case, in the Kurdish case, it turned out to be not a very good decision, unfortunately, for them.
So are there any first-hand observations you like to share, maybe from the first day or the first following weeks, and how it's transformed since then about the Kurdish people on the ground?
I mean, the referendum was managed in most cases well, in the sense that there was not violence. I mean, obviously, you have to take into account that not all Kurdish leaders were very enthusiastic and supportive of the referendum. I mean, the referendum is the child of the Mesut Barzani, the president of the Kurdistan regional government. And I mean, just yesterday he decided not to extend his term. So his term officially ends tomorrow, which is November 1st. But at the same time, folks in the south, in the Süleymaniye area, the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan, PUK people, the second major party in Kurdistan, they were not very supportive or enthusiastic about the referendum. So this basically creates some kind of a tension even before the days of the referendum. But ultimately, when it comes to the week before the referendum, it seems that they managed to cover their differences, and most people participate in the referendum in different areas of Kurdistan, and they voted yes. I mean, and then there were some other people, mostly from Europe, who basically observed the process. The referendum process, I'm talking about the specific day of referendum, it turned out to be fine. I was in Kirkuk for half of the day, and I also spent the night there. I mean, you also realize that in more non-Kurdish areas of Kirkuk, because Kirkuk is a very divided city with different communities, in more like Turkmen or Arab communities, the participation was very low. But in the Kurdish areas, among the Kurdish people living in Kirkuk, it was very high. I mean, so you basically get the sense of this division. In other parts of Kurdistan, it was mostly like people participated. Again, more in the northern part of Iraqi Kurdistan than in the south because of this political division between the Barzani's party and then the Taliban's party. But ultimately, I mean, it was done well. But what happened is that just a couple of days after the referendum, while I was still there, it became clear that there will be some very tangible consequences of it. And the most important thing initially was the closure of the Kurdish airports. Because, I mean, technically speaking, the airports are controlled by the Iraqi government. In practice, they are operated by the Kurdish authorities. But when the Kurds basically had their own independence referendum, then the Iraqi government in Baghdad decided to close down their two airports in Süleymaniye and in Erbil. And these are very important lifelines for the Kurdish region because they are landlocked. and their main contact with the outside world is done through these airports. And then on Friday, the referendum was on Monday, September 25th. And on Friday, September 29th, the airports were closed down. And I basically took one of the last flights from Erbil to just leave the region. But then, even like a couple of days after that, then yes, there was no violence, there was no military activity, but then the airports were closed down by the Iraqi authorities. And this basically created like some uncertainty and anxiety, even just a few days after the referendum took place.
Then are the airports still closed?
Yes, I mean, they are closed. The idea is that Iraqi government wants to have control over the customs of the Kurdish region. So, I mean, it may be solved very quickly if there's some kind of compromise, or it may continue like that for the foreseeable future. But I mean, especially after this defeat in the last 2 weeks, then the Kurds may be more willing to like make more compromises and concessions to the Iraqis so that at least they will basically get the airports to be open.
Okay, so touching on the Iraqi Kurdish relations, how do you think the surrounding countries, including Iraq, are reacting to the referendum? And how do you think the nature of the Middle East right now is affected by it?
I mean, so it has been this kind of traditional case in the sense that whenever Kurdish leaders ask for more power, more autonomy, or some sort of independence, as it happened just very recently, then most of the countries which has sizable Kurdish minorities always oppose them. And this is not surprising because if you look at Turkey, Turkey used to have some kind of a peace process with its own Kurdish opposition, Kurdish insurgency. The process collapsed terribly more than 2 years ago in the summer of 2015. And since then, the Kurdish question became a huge security dilemma for the Turkish authorities. So from the Turkish perspective, even if they used to have a very good relationship with the Iraqi Kurds until very recently, their bid for independence was perceived as a threat because, if nothing else, they thought that in the long run, it is going to create some kind of a demonstration effect among the Kurdish population in Turkey. So in a sense, it was not necessarily about Iraqi Kurds, but their demand for independence was more about like Turkey's perceptions on Kurdish problem. And you can make the same arguments regarding Iran, maybe even more so. And Iran has been adamantly opposing the referendum since its announcement. And its position was very clear-cut. I mean, we want to make sure that the Kurds will not basically get more power than they already enjoy. I mean, I can't tell much about Syria because the Syrian central government is completely fragmented at the moment. There's a large area in northern Syria, which is called in Kurdish Rojava. It basically means west. It is controlled by the Syrian Kurds, and which are being supported by the United States Army in their fight against the Islamic State. But the one thing important to keep in mind is that the relationship between the PYD, which is the main party in Syrian Kurdistan, and then the KDP, which is the main party in Iraqi Kurdistan, is not very friendly. I mean, their relationship also characterized by lots of tensions. So if you look more from a regional perspective, the Iraqi Kurds tried to make a bid for independence, but they did not get any support from any of the neighboring states. And this is important because, again, you're a landlocked country, you're heavily dependent on your oil exports, you don't have much to produce, you are fighting a war against Islamic State, then your economy has been in a crisis since 2014, and then at some point you need some strong regional allies. I mean, they say if you cannot really convince Turkey that your independence is also good for Turkey, it becomes more difficult because you're already facing lots of opposition from Baghdad, for the obvious reasons, and also from Iran. And in addition to that, even the international community, the Western states or non-Western states, were not very supportive of the Kurdish independence, with the exception of Israel, obviously. So by the third week of September or so, it became clear that the Kurdish diplomacy has not been very successful in getting support for the independence referendum. So by the time it became more like a kind of a very unilateral decision, which was perceived as being maximalist by both regional and international actors, which basically contribute to the isolation of the Iraqi Kurds.
So aside from Israel, are there any regional actors there that were in support of the referendum?
I mean, other countries were more lukewarm in a sense. Maybe Saudis, for example, they did not explicitly support the Kurdish independence, but they were not opposing very strongly either. So they were basically hedging their bets. Because, I mean, if you look from the Saudi perspective, let's say, I mean, common perception that the Baghdad government is much under the influence of Iran, Iran being a strong enemy of Saudis for the last maybe 30, 35 years. So from this perspective, having a Kurdish like enclave in Iraq can be in the interest of Saudis because it can basically, first of all, reduce the power of Iran in Iraq overall, but also like bring another ally to the Saudi side. But I mean, there were some calculations going on, but then when it became clear that the Kurdish independence was not going very well, then the Saudis did not become very supportive either. So I mean, some other countries basically hedged their bets, but other countries were also very strongly against it, like Egypt, for example. Egypt, it is not maybe one of the big priorities for them, but ultimately they just think that from our perspective, we believe in kind of the stable borders, and we are opposing any kind of secessionist movements in the region. So I mean, again, except for Israel, it's hard to say that the Kurdish independence receive any significant support. Maybe with the exception that obviously there are lots of Kurdish people living in different parts of the Middle East, but also in Europe, and many of them are basically enthusiastic and supportive of the Kurdish independence. Like, I mean, talking about some Kurdish people living in Iran, in Turkey, in Europe, and so on. But ultimately, they are not the decision makers at the state level.
So had there been more multilateral support rather than a unilateral decision by the Iraqi Kurds for this independence referendum, do you think it could have gone further than what it did? Or do you think it would have
yes,
been
for example,
halted?
if you think that this referendum thing is not basically new. I mean, the Masoud Barzani was talking about very seriously for the last 3 years, like since the summer of 2014. So it's not like it basically emerged out of blue and suddenly the Kurds become supportive of this idea. I mean, they have been trying to push forward this for the last 3 years. They postponed it because of the fight against the Islamic State, especially since their capture of Mosul and large territories in both Iraq and Syria. But then in 2014, for example, the Turkish-Kurdish relations are much better in the sense that Kurdistan has been a very important economic and political partner of Turkey during that time. And maybe you can make the assumption that the Kurdish leadership assumed that Turkey's opposition to their referendum will be more on the paper rather than in action, and they counted on it. But ultimately, this was a miscalculation because Turkey, more because of its internal reasons, rather than maybe like specific hostility towards the Iraqi Kurdish leadership, also took a very strong position against it. And I mean, you can make the argument that again, if nobody supports you in substantial terms, then it becomes very difficult to achieve what you are asking for, because I mean, it is not some kind of a new negotiations within the state. You want to establish a new state. And then unless maybe you also have a very strong military power, which turned out to be not the case, as we have seen in the last 2 weeks, then yeah, I mean, it just becomes a very difficult process to continue.
So what components do you think, whether institutionally or structurally, are necessary to create a viable Kurdistan as an independent nation one day in the future?
So 2 dimensions to it. The first dimension is more about internal, because internal dimension was also very important because I just briefly mentioned about these internal divisions in the Kurdistan. I mean, the Iraqi Kurdistan is a multi-party, like a system, in the sense that there are 2, maybe 3 major parties and then a bunch of other smaller parties. So there's some fragmentation and pluralism. But at the same time, these parties are not very institutionalized. They are more like the personal device of some leaders and families. So in the sense that many Kurdish people or intellectuals were always complaining about the lack of democracy and lack of accountability, lack of transparency in their system, and there was a huge amount of corruption too. And for example, the Kurdish parliament has been closed for the last 2 years until recently. I mean, it was closed down because of some internal fight between 2 parties in 2015, and it was not really opened until just like very recently. And even at the moment, it's not functioning very well. So, I mean, this has been always an issue for the Kurdish political leadership because, again, ultimately, when it comes to referendum, yes, it was Barzani's project. It was not completely enthusiastically supported by the other political actors, especially in Suleimani in the south. And then when the Iraqi army made a move to Kirkuk, then the Kurds did not have a unified front, so they cannot defend the city. They had to withdraw, and then it became a huge disaster for them. So in a sense, the lack of internal unity has been always a issue for the Kurds. The second thing is that, again, like more international arena. I mean, from the Kurdish perspective, they expected more American support because the idea is that, well, we have been allies of the United States in the region at least since 2003, since the invasion of Iraq, and we can actually trace it back maybe to the early 1990s, when the Kurdish enclave was first formed in 1992. And then their reasoning is that since there's a new administration in DC, which is the Trump administration, and one of the priorities of the Trump administration in foreign policy is to roll back the Iranian influence, and the Kurdish diplomacy is trying to portray themselves as a strong reliable American ally, which can help United States to roll back the Iranian influence. So they basically count on that. But the problem with this kind of assumption or strategy is that from American perspective, Iraq is still too valuable to be lost. And the idea is that from American perspective, if we can support the Iraqi Prime Minister al-Abadi, he is not completely under the influence of Iranians, so he has his own independent base. So as long as we can basically give him some support, then it will be better for us. So rather than basically just putting all our bags in the Kurdish basket, it is better for us to basically hedge our bets in the sense that we don't completely abandon the Kurds, but we don't support their independence either, and we try to still continue to work with the Abadi. And again, some Kurdish leaders will basically become very disappointed with the American policy, but this has been the American policy for a long time. And I mean, the United States tried to change the mind of the Kurdish leadership from going with the referendum, but they were ultimately unsuccessful. And again, like if you think about this both internal and then foreign dynamics, again, I mean, it always comes to the issue of if you don't have a very viable internal like leadership, plus you are regionally insulated, then it becomes very difficult to achieve the goal of independence. I mean, in politics, you cannot basically make very strong statements about the foreseeable future, but many people, especially considering what happened in the last 2 weeks or so, well, I mean, you can make the argument that the Kurdish independence looks much remote than it used to look maybe a month ago or like 2 months ago, especially because of what happened in the last 2 weeks, which basically resulted in huge territorial losses by the Kurds to the Iraqi central government and the Shiite militias.
So you talked about how the Kurdish people have very fragmented government. Do you think that installing a democratic form of government would help them in their initiative to try to get more U.S. support for their independence?
I mean, it's kind of an ironic situation because I will not say especially if you compare to other Middle Eastern countries, I mean, there's more pluralism, political pluralism in the Iraqi Kurdish region than most of the other places. But at the same time, there is not much democracy within the parties. So the parties are basically more like tools of the very strong leaders or their families. So this is kind of irony because, well, okay, you can make the argument that if there had been a single very hegemonic party, like it is the case in Syria, the PYD in Rojava, like the Kurdish PYD, then they will have a much stronger stance against the Iraqi military moves, like 2 weeks ago. But at the same time, this may actually come at the expense of democracy. So, I mean, it is hard to say that if having more democracy will definitely help them to achieve more, like the goals. Well, I'm not sure of that. But ultimately, again, if you think about Iraqi Kurdistan, you basically see more pluralism. But then this pluralism doesn't always mean more freedom, especially within the enclaves controlled by different parties. It's more about, like, for example, not having a unified military command, because, I mean, Peshmerga, the Kurdish military forces, they are basically responsible to different parties, KDP of Barzani and the Patriotic Union of Kurdistan of Taliban's family. But ultimately, even within this Peshmerga, there are different divisions. So it's not like there's a single uniform command which can basically organize an effective defense of the territory against Iraqis. And this became like the main reason why the Kurds could not basically defend Kirkuk. And they lost it basically in less than 6 hours on the night of October 16. To be honest, it was actually a surprise, I think, to anybody I know. Because I was in Kirkuk, and during the referendum day, the Kurdish forces seemed to be in total control. So you don't feel that, I mean, this place will be abandoned in basically a couple of hours. But again, I mean, there's too much uncertainty, too much things you cannot anticipate in advance. And this is basically what happened on the night of October 16, when the entire Kurdish defense, because of all these divisions, did not show lots of resistance. And the Iraqis and the Shia militias basically entered the city very easily. And since then, they already also made lots of military gains in different parts of the disputed territories.
Touching on Kirkuk, is there any reason, aside from, you know, the abundance of oil, that it was such a contested piece of land?
I mean, obviously oil is one of the main reasons, but also there is this historical maybe symbolism which you cannot underestimate. I mean, for example, in 1970, there was an autonomy agreement between the Saddam Hussein's Ba'ath Party, which was also in power by that time, and Mustafa Barzani's leadership. Mustafa Barzani is obviously the father of Masoud Barzani. And the reason why this autonomy agreement, and which was the most promising agreement of from the Kurdish perspective in the 20th century, why it didn't work out, but primarily because of Kirkuk. Because the idea is that how are you going to divide up the city? I mean, the province itself has a Kurdish majority, But at the same time, there is a sizable minority of the Turkmens and Arabs living in the city, and especially after the 1960s and 70s, the Iraqi government tried to change the demographic balance too. So there's basically a very mixed group of people there. And yes, it is about oil, but at the same time, it's also about like this history of claiming a place and not abandoning, because if you abandon it, then you basically just make a huge concession, and you cannot give a huge concession unless you get something in return from both perspectives. And from the Iraqi perspective and the Kurdish perspective, because they are heavily invested historically, symbolically, and economically, it doesn't help them for any leader to basically abandon it without getting anything intangible in return from the other side. I mean, you can debate whether the Kirkuk or an independent Kurdistan without Kirkuk can be viable, because Kurdistan has also other different kind of oil fields which are still controlled by the Kurdish government. But I mean, let me give you more precise numbers. So as far as I know, the Iraqi Kurds used to produce around 700,000 barrels of oil per day before the referendum. And then around 2/3 of this oil was obtained from the large fields in the or around the Kirkuk area. So I mean, you can basically think about the numbers and then you see how central to their political economy. But again, I mean, then the question becomes, if there's a mixed population in Kirkuk, and if you want to make a compromise, what can be the solution for that? And I mean, since the dissolution of the Ba'ath regime in Iraq in 2003, the Kurds really increased their control over the Kirkuk, but then there has been no real political solution. And especially given the fact the Iraqi army captured back in the last 2 weeks, then obviously this basically really reduced the Kurdish leverage over the Iraqis. Because now it's basically the other situation. I mean, the Kurds used to control the city, now the Iraqis control it, and the question becomes, whoever controls it then has more leverage over the other side, more or less. So this is the reason why it became kind of a huge loss for the Kurdish leadership, just like losing it like without much fight, and then in a very surprising way, I would say.
Iraq and the Kurdish struggle, they're so interconnected. What would you say would happen to Iraq if the Kurdish people were to separate and create a viable state? Do you think Iraq would bounce back, or do you think they'd be
the
affected?
conventional wisdom about Iraq in the last 5 or 6 years, maybe let's say since 2011, is that it has been a failed state. Mm-hmm. But then, I mean, the developments on the ground in the last year seems to challenge this common wisdom, because what you see is that Iraqi army and then their Shia militias actually turn out to be gaining lots of territory back. I mean, initially from the Islamic State, but also now from the Kurds. And then the Abadi has been a more successful, viable leader so far than his predecessor, Nur al-Maliki. He has been less open to Iranian influence. He has been more successful in the diplomatic front. I mean, just like last week, he was visiting Riyadh, the Saudi capital, Cairo, Egyptian capital, Tehran, the Iranian capital, and then the Ankara, the Turkish capital. I mean, so in a sense, if you think about his portfolio and profile, he becomes more kind of a visible leader. So the thing is that this common wisdom of Iraq being a failed state may not be that accurate at the moment, which basically means that if this is the case, then the Kurdish demand for independence become even more complicated, because one reason why the Kurds always ask for independence and why it was so like the support is, I mean, other than this history of political violence at the hands of the Saddam Hussein and so on, is because from their perspective, well, because we become a more viable territory, we have all these basic achievements, so why shall we basically forced to become part of a failed state, which is called Iraq? And this has been their kind of a talking point, with some good reason. But again, now the Iraq looks more viable than ever in the last 5 or 6 years, that this basically put more kind of a doubt on Kurdish claims, at least from the international observer's perspective.
So then, with Iraq transforming, I guess coming out of that failed state perception, the U.S. position has always been vague in terms of, the Kurdish statehood, and you already talked about this earlier. But do you think the U.S. has reason to support Kurdish self-rule if they believe that Iraq is not going to become any more of a failed state, or if the Kurdish will be more powerful as an
American opposition to Kurdish independence was more about timing than its substance. And even like from the Turkish perspective, it was more about like why you want to have a referendum now rather than you can't become independent. Because I mean, from a normative position, you can make a strong argument that the Kurds deserve and should become independent. But obviously, from a geopolitical perspective, then you have to look at the correlation of force on the ground and try to make sense of whether it is a feasible project or not. So these are obviously two different questions. So again, I mean, from the American perspective, a failed Iraq is not a good thing. Well, if nothing else, there's a sunk investment there. You are talking about the 2000 invasion. More than 4,000 American soldiers were killed. More than 125,000 Iraqis were also killed. It was a huge economic cost. The entire country was devastated and so on. So the thing is that from American perspective, you invade a country and then you end up having a complete failed state is not something that can be easily acceptable. So this is the first thing. The second thing is that, again, from the American perspective, and when I talk about American perspective, interestingly, I see lots of similarities between the Obama and Trump administration, and even maybe like since the George W. Bush administration. So despite the fact that they have lots of ideological differences, they also have lots of similarities when it comes to Iraq and the Kurdish policy. But it means that, well, a failed Iraq will be just an entity which will be completely controlled by Iran, which is the main hostile force to the United States in the region, and this is also unacceptable. So in a sense, the America's Kurdish policy has been always secondary to America's Iraqi policy. And the Kurdish diplomacy tries to change it, but so far it has not been very successful. Because, I mean, again, from the Kurdish perspective, they always make the argument that, well, Iraq is a failed state, and we should not be condemned to live in a failed state because we have been much more successful since 2003. And the second point is that, well, we also have a good American ally which can reduce the influence of hostile states like Iran in the region. Discourse, or when these two teams are used by the Kurds to convince the Americans to support them, it doesn't always convince them, for the simple reason is that because America still has a huge investment in Baghdad, in Iraq. So then this basically puts them in a more disadvantaged position, the Kurdish leadership. And this is the reason why I did not get support for the independence referendum, just like last month.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's all that we have for today.
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming. It was very insightful, Dr. Tezcur.
My pleasure to you. Thank you.
Thank you.